just noticed how sometimes God will bring something to your attention and he does it in multiple avenues and you're like, oh yeah, you hear this like topic, you hear this word, you hear whatever, and then you hear it again elsewhere and you're like, oh, and then you hear it again and you're like, I think that God's trying to teach me something important here. And so this is what's happened to me over the last 2 weeks, is that I saw this podcast, which we're going to not watch the full podcast, we're going to watch a piece of this podcast. And that was the first of it that kind of came to my mind. And then we read in Bible study about a very similar experience. And so I put them together in a sermon today because I was like, maybe somebody else needs to hear this besides me. So what we're about to watch, a brief, those of you who were in Sabbath school last week heard me mention the story. I'm going to let Sadie tell the story herself. But we're about to watch, in case you don't know who's who on this screen. On your right is a Sadie Robertson Huff from Duck Dynasty fame, if anybody ever watched that show. She's interviewing Priscilla Shirer, who is also, if you don't know her, she's been in some Christian movies lately, but she's also really well known in the broader Christian world for Bible studies that she puts out. And so this is Sadie was interviewing Priscilla, but she tells her a specific story about something that Priscilla did. You can see it in the title. Priscilla called her out for something, and I just loved this story. So we're going to have Sadie tell it in her own words, and we'll go from there. Yeah, she goes on to share more of it, but you got hopefully you got the gist of the story and what happened there for her. Now, have you ever had an experience where somebody has called you out? Maybe not in the way, that exact way. When you think of it, you don't have to share it. I just want you to see if something comes to mind. Because I have had an experience like this when I was thinking about it, and this is what clearly came to my mind, is this experience. And it was one where it was here in Wrangell. It's about five years ago or thereabouts. And I don't even remember like what I had said, but I remember the after effect because I remember just like Sadie, my response to it. And I remember that something had happened in a group setting. And again, I don't remember what I had said, but I kind of walked away from that setting, and nobody else seemed to think anything was strange. But a friend of mine who is older and wiser comes up behind me, and she pulls me aside, a waft from the group, and she goes, I don't know if you meant to say this way, but like what you said to this person, that was actually really rude. And you're supposed to be setting an example I was doing something with leadership, and you're supposed to be setting this example. So if you're setting this example of like being rude to this person or making this comment to people, you're going to open it up for thinking other people can do that as well, and then that's okay. And just like Sadie said in there, I was embarrassed because I was like, first of all, I didn't think that what I had said was that bad. But kind of like what Sadie said too, I was a little bit defensive and I was a little bit like, I can sort of see that, but I'm not, like I didn't mean. And she's like, I know you didn't. And she's like, that's why I'm just pulling you aside. It wasn't a situation where like anybody else really like noticed it, but she's like, I just want you to like be aware that that's how it came across. And so later, as I got to think about it, I thought, number one, she was very brave to pull me aside and tell me that. Because a lot of us are conflict avoidant and we don't want to do that to other people. But she did it in such a loving way too that when I thought about it later, I was like, you know what? Again, just like Sadie and Priscilla, Sadie's like, you were actually really right. And what Sadie goes on to say to Priscilla, she's like, you changed the whole trajectory of like what I post. I took down those posts that didn't represent what I wanted people to see of me as a godly woman. And now I post things with not just myself. She was laughing about, she's like, I got all these selfies. She's like, I post things with my family, I post things with friends, I post other things that are not just me, and want them to be God-honoring. And it was the same way with what this person has said to me, is after that, it really got me thinking, like, this person was right, and I'm glad that they said something to me about it. So as you're thinking about this, let's go over to Nehemiah 5, because I ran into the next story. I saw this podcast, it just showed you guys a piece of it. And then we were studying this story, and I was like, okay, Lord, I'm listening. There is something in here that you want us to know and to hear. So Nehemiah 5. Now let's set this up for a moment. So remember, Nehemiah is known as the builder of the wall. This is after the city has been destroyed. the first time. And the people have been coming back, and Nehemiah is coming back with some of the earlier folks and trying to rebuild this wall. Now, we tend to think of him as just, he's just there, almost just doing construction, but he really operates as a governor as well. And we're going to see Nehemiah in the role of the governor in this case. So they're doing all the work they can. Remember also that they're receiving a lot of opposition. There's a lot of people in the surrounding areas that are coming up against them, creating problems, making it hard for them to do this. But now we have an internal problem that shows up, and this is Nehemiah 5. And it says this: "Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their Jewish brothers." So this isn't even an attack from without, this is in their own people. "Some were saying, 'We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain.' Others were saying, 'We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, our homes to get grain during the famine.' Still others were saying, 'We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our countrymen, and though our sons are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and vineyards belong to others." So what's the problem here before we carry on? People have come back. They don't come back really rich. They're coming back, though, at God's command to come back, and they're saying, "We can't afford these different things. Our fields are mortgaged to the hilt, right? Our children, we are selling them into slavery." Don't think of slavery in the terms of what we think of the American South slavery. Think of slavery more as like, this is supposed to be a time-limited thing to help pay off a debt. And this is what's happening. And actually, this is happening with their fellow Jews, are the ones that are taking the land and not giving it back, and taking their children into slavery and not allowing them to redeem them. In verse 6, so it says, "When I heard their outcry," this is Nehemiah, "and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, 'You are exacting usury from our own countrymen.' So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, 'As far as possible, we have bought back our Jewish brothers who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your brothers only for them to be sold back to us.' They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, 'What are you doing? What you're doing is not right. Should you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain, but let the exacting of the usury stop. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, houses, and also the usury you are charging them, the 100th part of money, grain, new wine, and oil.' 'We will give it back,' they said, 'and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say.' Then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised. I also shook out the folds of my robe and said, 'In this way may God shake out of his house and possession every man who does not keep this promise. So may such a man be shaken out and emptied.'" So Nehemiah is rightly so upset. And you might go, yeah, he's upset. But to understand why he's so upset, we actually need to go to a book that maybe you don't go to very often, but immediately, because you all know I've been mentioning reading through the Bible, I've just came out of Leviticus, and I saw this exact thing in Leviticus that God was talking about. So let's go over to Leviticus 25, because you know that Nehemiah knew his Bible, what they had for a Bible then. And so when Nehemiah is outraged, this is the type of stuff that he's thinking of in his mind. So Leviticus 25, and there's lots in 25, but I'm going to take you to 25:25. And it says this: "If one of your countrymen becomes poor and sells some of his property, his nearest relative is to come and redeem what his countryman has sold. If, however, a man has no one to redeem it for him, but he himself prospers and acquires sufficient means to redeem it, he is to determine the value for the years, since he has sold it, and refund the balance to the man who he sold it to. He can then go back to his own property. But if he does not acquire the means to repay him, what he sold will remain in possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. It will be returned to him in Jubilee, and he can then go back to his property." Now, if we continue on, we will see that, if you skim over here, that there's more he talks about with the selling of the land, redeeming land, etc. But then he gets to verse 46. Or 47, excuse me. If an alien or temporary resident among you becomes rich, and one of your countrymen becomes poor and sells himself to the alien living among you, or a member of the alien clans, he retains the right of redemption after he sold himself. One of his relatives may redeem him. And I'm going to skim down to verse 53. He is to be treated as a man hired for year to year, but see to it that his owner does not rule over him ruthlessly. Even if he is not redeemed in any of these ways, he and his children are to be released in the year of Jubilee. And 39, we're backing up. If one of your countrymen becomes poor among you and sells himself to you, do not make him work as a slave. He is to be treated as a hired worker or a temporary resident among you. He is to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then he and his children are to be released, and he will go back to his own clan and to the property of his forefathers. And in here too, even though I didn't hit this, he does specifically say you should not charge interest or usury against your own people. Notice repeatedly that God sets up the system where there should be the possibility of redeeming your family members, redeeming your land, right? It says in Leviticus 25, if you read the whole thing, there's multiple ways for that to be done. That if someone's too poor and they can't buy their land back, if another relative can do it and buy it back for them, they should do it without charging additional interest. If somebody's too poor and has to sell their children into slavery in these terms, again, they're not to hold them forever, and if somebody else can redeem them beforehand, they should be allowed to do so. That was not what's happening here. And so Nehemiah is going like, wait a minute, we just got out of slavery to our Gentile rulers, and you're putting us, our own people, back into slavery, and not only are you doing that, but you're charging. And what I find so interesting here is that Nehemiah is willing to call them out, just like what we were just hearing a moment ago with Sadie and Priscilla, with the story that I told. Now, he does it in a different way because of the setting. He doesn't do this kind of quiet pull aside. Obviously, he couldn't do a text message, that didn't exist. But he does it in a way that is very public. And why does he do it in a very public setting? Because this is something that is happening widespread. It is something that the leadership is doing, and the leadership is held to a higher standard. So when he calls them out, he has them all together. And he tells them straight, right? This is kind of the formula. He restates the problem. He gives them clear expectations, and he holds accountability. Because we see in there, he says to them what the problem is. He tells them, you are taking usury from your own countrymen, right? And this is a problem. Moses set up these rules that God gave back then to say, this is how we deal with these situations, and you're not doing it. You're just buying up people's land, you're buying up their children, and there's no way for them to get them back the way that you're setting this up, and you're charging interest on them, so they're just never going to be able to get out of this debt. And so he tells them not only that, right, but he says to them, what he wants them to do. Here's my expectation, right? He says, now you are selling, this is earlier when he's talking to them, now you are selling your brothers only for them to be sold back. And they don't have a response. He says, what you're doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach? And then he tells them what he wants them to do. Immediately give back the land. Immediately give back the people. You should not be doing this. We're trying to build our territory, and calls them out in that. And then he not only does that, but he makes it so that they have to be accountable. I didn't read far enough into here, but if you look further, he does actually summon the priest and the folks as witness too, to say, this is how this is going to happen. These people are witnessing this, and their response, to their credit, is not a response that we see other times too. When we get called out, it's really hard. We get defensive, right? We get like, and they have nothing to say because they know that Nehemiah is right? And so they just, when they finally say something, they just say, we will give it back. And this is verse 12. And we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. And they do it. And I love this story because how many times in our lives are we able to see the full circle of when somebody calls you out in it, and calling somebody out is not comfortable. How we handle things can be good and bad. We've all been in a situation where somebody called you out and it didn't go well, that they didn't do it from a spirit of love. And one of my other favorite verses is like, when we're talking with people, how do we deal with them? And you all know this principle. This is Matthew 18:15-20, and it says this. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. This is a great principle. This is a principle that even at work, when somebody comes to tell me something in my position, depending upon what it is, I'm like, well, have you talked to the other person before you've talked to me about it? If you have, then let's talk. If you haven't, perhaps you should go talk to them first. And very biblical. And if they listen to you, you have won them over. Right? That's the best case scenario. That's the scenario that we were talking about at the beginning, where somebody brings it to your attention and you go, yeah, you know what? You're right. Now, keep in mind, if you're the one that's calling somebody out, it doesn't always go that way. And how we're doing it really matters, right? It would probably have been a lot harder for me to accept what my friend had told me if she had done it in a group setting because of this scenario. It was much better for her to pull me aside, particularly because of what it was. She's like, I don't think anybody else really noticed, but I noticed. So it wasn't something where she felt like she needed to say something to me in that group and everybody else needed to hear that. In Nehemiah's case, he was like, everybody needs to hear this isn't okay, and we need to set the expectation of this. Now it says, but if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church, and if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Now this gives us a degree of like, if you try to, bring something to somebody's attention, and it's an ongoing issue, and they don't resolve the issue, bring the matter to their attention. If that doesn't work, then yes, you can bring it to church. Now, what we get confused by is what says, we'll just treat them like a pagan and a tax collector. Well, how does Jesus treat pagans and tax collectors? Right? Like, he's not saying this to just like kick him out, beat him up, whatever. He's not saying anything like that. He's going basically the privileges that might come with being, air quotes, a church member, right? They may not have some of those privileges in there. It doesn't mean that you're still not loving to them, etc., but they maybe no longer get to have that close influence or decision-making within your body of believers. Doesn't mean you don't still love them. Doesn't mean that they still can't be a part of whatever you're doing. It just means that they don't get to have as much influence anymore because there's something that is ongoing. And I love that Jesus points this out as an example, like how do we do this? How do we call people out? And how do we respond to it? That's the next piece we're going to look at. There's several things across the Bible about how we respond to this, and this is just a couple of them. This is Colossians 3:12 and 13. It says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. It's setting the expectation up for, let's say that you do notice something. There's a time and place to say something. And sometimes we may just say, that is not the time to say something. We don't have to run around, and in fact, I don't think this would be helpful, run around and critique everybody's sentence to call them all out. That is not helpful. So knowing when to say something and when not to say something is something that God can help us with and have the wisdom of that. Especially if it's something small. Sometimes somebody just kind of slips up on something and you don't need to jump down their throat. You can kind of just go, well, I probably didn't mean that. You can let that go. But for bigger things, it is worth that. And how do we respond? Again, the best case scenario, and Sadie said Priscilla, the way she sent the text, she knew that Priscilla was saying it out of love, of like, this is an older woman kind of looking back in this younger woman's life and like, I don't know if you mean this, but I just want you to be aware, like this is how this comes across, and I'm just saying this for you, and it changed your life. The same thing with how the person came to me. I knew that they were saying it not to be critical. I knew that they were saying it out of best interest for me. They really cared about me. And how I know that? They had put time and energy into me before that even happened. So it wasn't like a complete stranger came up to me and did this. Now in Proverbs 19:11 it says this, a person's wisdom yields patience. It is to one's glory to overlook an offense. Again, being mindful of like, when do you want to make something a big deal and when do you not? In James 1:19, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And I think this goes both ways. Being the person that somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I kind of noticed that what you said was a little rude, or I don't know if you notice that you're posting these things on your social media that maybe aren't very godly or really not portraying, that God's will for your life. And we can be defensive. Yep, you're going to have whatever the feeling is. But can you slow that down enough to be able to hear what the person's saying to you instead of shooting right back at them of like, you're wrong, you don't know what you're talking about, etc. Can we slow it down if we're the ones and kind of say, is there a kernel of truth? And this is something that in my life I try to implement other times too. In a job where I do get criticism from either the people that I'm working with or whatever, or hear lots of stories about conflicts too, I try to remember sometimes when people bring things to my attention, is there a kernel of truth in here? Like, I like to think of it that way. Like, I don't have to take the whole thing that they just said to me, but is there something in here that's true that I can change? Sometimes it is all just garbage, and you're like, that is not. But sometimes there's something in there that I'm like, okay, I don't appreciate the way they just said that to me, but, there is something here. Maybe my tone I need to be a little more careful with that. Or maybe the way I came off there wasn't good, and I can take that little piece and I can do something with that. But I can only do that if I can slow down long enough. You're going to get, and I will just say this, you're going to get defensive. Just like what Sadie said when Priscilla mentioned it to her. I was defensive. That's your natural reaction. That's not bad. It's can you wait through that long enough to be able to come up with a clear response. But here's the thing. We're not doing this alone. In case you're wondering, we're not doing this alone. In Jeremiah 32:27 says this, I am the Lord, the God of all mankind. Is anything too hard for me? No. Nothing is too hard for God. No situation, even if you're afraid to go talk to somebody, if you're afraid to cause some conflict or whatever, God can help us when we're doing that. God can help us when we're receiving that. This is not something that we're going to do and try on our own, but it is something that God wants to help us do with. He wants us to live in peace. We know that. Ultimately, the fruit of the Spirit, and one of the fruits of the Spirit is peace. He doesn't want us living in turmoil and conflict. That doesn't mean that we don't step up and say things when we need to say them. But remember this. Being called out is not comfortable, but sometimes it is necessary. Sometimes God himself is calling into our own lives. Maybe it's not somebody else, but God often uses other people. Maybe it's God himself that's pointing something out to you, and you're like, oh, okay, Lord, I don't like that. That's called your conscience, by the way. If you've ever had that little ping later and you're like, ooh, that didn't sound right, or whatever. If you've ever had that little internal fight where you're like, that wasn't too bad, but the fact that you're fighting in your head tells you that it probably wasn't good, because otherwise you're probably not going to be thinking about it. You're just going on light. But if you're starting to get the little back and forth, that's God, through the Holy Spirit, kind of saying, hey, that was not your finest moment. You might want to change something. And we need to be listening to that voice. That's the little voice can help us make the corrections that we need in our life. And God wants to help us do that. He wants us to remember that he's here to do that for us. So when I look at this story with Nehemiah, and when I think about my own experience, and I think about the experience that Sadie had, I look at this and go, not all conflict is bad. And if we're willing to listen, and we're willing to let God work within our lives, things can be changed. You can make change from these things. And just like the men in this story, I want to be able to say, I'm going to do what you say. Whatever it is that you say, Lord, I will do it, because I know that you have my best interest in heart, and the only reason you're calling me out is because you love me. Our